thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's rural proofing is something I've been interested in for a long time, actually. So it's really great to be here to share some of the things that I've learned over the last few years, looking at the experiences of different countries in terms of what they've been doing on rural proofing. So my name is Jane Atterton. I'm based in Edinburgh. As I say, I work for SRUC, Scotland's Rural College, and there I run a unit called the Rural Policy Centre, and we do lots of work on rural policy issues, place-based policy, rural proofing, and digital connectivity, all sorts of issues, demographic change. So it was really interesting to hear Alexia's presentation and all of those issues being mentioned there. So what I would like to do today is cover three main issues and then offer some concluding comments. The first thing I'd like to do is just very briefly introduce you to 6 countries and their experiences of rural proofing. And these are the 6 countries that I covered in the background paper that Veronica mentioned. I'd then like to briefly mention Ireland, and it was great to hear William's intervention just a few minutes ago, and also some experiences from Scotland, not on rural proofing, but on island proofing, which is something that Scotland is now doing since 2018. Then I'd like to draw out 6 key themes in terms of differences and similarities between those countries, and then offer what I think are some of the most important lessons that can be learned from these experiences in the different countries. And then, as I say, some final concluding comments at the end. Before I go to those 3 key themes, what I thought would be useful was just to go back and say, okay, so what is rural proofing? Alexia mentioned this a few times in her presentation, but it's very much about requiring policymakers to think rural when they design policy interventions. But it's not just about thinking rural, it's about then acting. So if you're a policymaker and you're assessing your policy for its potential rural impacts, you then have to act to adjust the policy if there is likely to be a negative outcome for rural areas. So it's going through a checklist, which many countries have, and then making an adjustment to that policy to prevent those negative outcomes. But I guess that also raises another question about what does that actually mean in reality? If rural proofing is about preventing negative outcomes for rural areas, is it then about ensuring that the outcomes are the same or neutral for rural and urban places? And what happens if preventing negative outcomes for rural areas and therefore achieving positive outcomes for rural areas means there might be negative outcomes in urban areas? And I think these are some of the sort of fundamental questions that are really interesting to discuss about rural proofing. The quote at the bottom of the slide there is from DEFRA, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the UK government. And they talk about rural proofing being about fair and equitable policy outcomes for rural areas. And they very much emphasize the need to deliver policies in the right way in rural areas, and they focus on implementation. So there's certainly something about being fair and something about the importance of the way that policies are delivered. And that might have to be different in rural areas and indeed different in different rural areas compared to urban areas. So just to move on from that to the 6 countries that I'd like to touch on, I started with Canada. So Canada established something called the Rural Secretariat in 1996. And it's really been termed the rural conscience of the federal government in Canada. So the Rural Secretariat was set up to coordinate the federal government's focus on rural, to advocate for rural and rural policy, and promote dialogue at different levels between rural areas and between the federal government. In 1998, something called the Rural Lens was established, and you can see a picture of the document there. So this was a tool, an optional tool for federal policymakers to review their policies and programs from the start, from the outset of that policy being designed, and taking into account the perspectives of rural people. And with the tool, there was a Rural Lens unit established within the Rural Secretariat. And you can see some of the considerations in that Rural Lens on the slide there. But there was no legislative requirement. There was a tendency for rural proofing or the Rural Lens tool to be used too late in the policy process. There was no sanctions if anyone didn't do it, and there was no responsibility for policymakers to report back to the Rural Lens Unit about what they did to change their policies if they were required to do so. So there was lots of work that went on by the Rural Lens behind the scenes, but actually they didn't get a lot of credit because any changes that were made to policies were done by policymakers, and the credit went to them. The Rural Secretariat was also housed within the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food in Canada. And really the department, it was a sectoral department, but also it had no great authority to bring together or to require other departments to do anything. And also it lacked resources and money, a familiar story. So the mandate of the Rural Secretariat was not renewed in 2013, and there's no formal mechanism in Canada now for rural proofing. It does still exist as an optional tool, the Rural Lens, but it's very rarely used. And certainly the feeling amongst stakeholders is that the Canadian government as a whole has shifted a focus away from rural. In England, there was a formal commitment to rural proof in the 2000 Rural White Paper, and DEFRA, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has produced guidance, all sorts of guidance over the years for how rural proofing should be undertaken. And it was also designated as the rural champion, to champion rural and rural proofing across the UK government and to be an advocate for rural. There was separate organisations, the Countryside Agency, the Commission for Rural Communities, tasked with monitoring and reporting independent of government what sort of rural proofing activity was going on both at national and regional level. And there was various responsibilities placed on different levels of government, from the regional officers of the central government, but also organisations like rural community councils at the local level to feed in local voices. Rural proofing is a requirement, and it's written into the UK Treasury's Green Book, which says that policymakers have to provide a description of the rationale for their policy and commentary as to whether it's likely to have rural impacts or not, what the effect is, what the costs and benefits are. And departments should report annually. Unfortunately, there's no longer, the Countryside Agency, Commission for Rural Communities organisations no longer exists. So there's no longer an independent monitoring of rural proofing activity. And I think it's fair to say that when their reports were written and were published, they revealed a very, very mixed picture about the success of rural proofing. There were certainly some successes, and actually getting rural proofing into the UK Treasury's Green Book in itself was a success. But actually, the reality was there was a lot of challenges to introducing rural proofing. It wasn't fully embedded in departments' policymaking. It was a bit ad hoc, sometimes depending on the interests of an individual policymaker. It was often done too late in the policymaking process. It was the checklist was seen as a tick box and nothing more. There was confusion about who should be doing what. And also, although it was mandatory, there were no consequences if people didn't do it. And there was a lack of knowledge of rural in different departments. So since 2000, there's been repeated calls for rural proofing to be strengthened, to be refreshed. And DEFRA has done so. It has refreshed its commitment to rural proofing. And in 2020, there was a rural proofing report issued by DEFRA, called for by House of Lords Select Committee. And that report has lots of examples of successful rural proofing in it, but of course it was written by DEFRA, so it wasn't necessarily an independent review of what had been going on. So a rather mixed picture in England, but that commitment has been there to rural proof since 2000. In terms of Northern Ireland very much, I think we'll hear more from Sally later about Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland very much followed the England, not model, but the same sort of idea as England up until 2015, when the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development introduced legislation to the Northern Ireland Assembly to make rural proofing statutory. And as far as I'm aware, Northern Ireland remains the only country to have legislated for rural proofing. So the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland is required to regularly review bodies to which the Act applies, provide advice, commission research, publish an annual report. There should be a ministerial statement to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and the department exists to encourage information exchange between public authorities. I think it would be great to be able to say that legislation has been the answer and rural proofing is done brilliantly and effectively and fully and well all the time. But I think it's fair to say that that's not the case. I know Sally will probably have lots to say on this later. There's been calls for more clarity. The Assembly wasn't sitting for a while, so there was no ministerial report, so that you could argue no accountability. And as Sally will no doubt say, that it's in Northern Ireland, the name, the Rural Needs Act, it's very much founded on rural need, rural disadvantage, and that's never really been properly articulated. And I'm sure that's something that we'll come back to. I know we're going to hear more about Finland too, so I won't say too much, but Finland is always described as having both a broad and a narrow rural policy. So general policies that are, rural proofed, I suppose, and effectively work in rural areas, but also targeted policies as well. So rural proofing in Finland is voluntary. It's undertaken by policymakers using guidance and a checklist, like many other countries, and responsibility lies with the Rural Policy Council, which was set up by the government. It's chaired by the minister, and my understanding is that it includes a really wide range of stakeholders from lots of different levels of government, academics, NGOs, village movements. So it's characterized by very strong vertical and horizontal networks and has a strong advocacy role. So there's links very strongly to the local level, but also to the national level government. And as I say, we'll hear more about Finland later. I was involved in a piece of work for the Swedish Agency for Growth Policy Analysis back in 2016, where we were asked to look at the rural proofing experiences of England in a report that also looked at Finland and Canada from a rural proofing perspective, and Finland and Norway from a rural policy perspective. And this at the time was to inform discussions in the Rural Committee of the Swedish Parliament about introducing rural proofing. Now, I know that there's been work been going on since then in Sweden, and I think my understanding is there's some new guidance that's about to be published that's been prepared recently. And I know lots of work going on at the regional and local levels about how rural proofing should be undertaken there. But I understand that the term geographical proofing or looking through a geographical lens is actually the preferred term. So there may be lots to learn from Sweden and some of the examples there, but also some challenges like how do we account for local and regional diversity? How can variations in implementation be overcome? So an interesting example, and I think quite a current example from which we can probably learn lots. And just finally, New Zealand, they introduced a formal commitment to rural proof in 2018. I haven't heard much since. There's guidance, and again, there's a checklist. And I understand from a colleague that actually rural proofing has somewhat fallen off the radar in New Zealand recently, partly due to COVID and the emphasis on the pandemic. Yeah, not much happening in New Zealand. It may be similar to Ireland, but it would be interesting to know why that's not the case. As I said, just to briefly mention Ireland and Scotland, it's great that William spoke earlier about the Irish experience. I just pulled out a couple of documents there, the Charter for Rural Ireland, I think in 2016, and the current Our Rural Future Rural Development Policy document, both of which include this commitment to rural proofing. They talk about fair and equitable outcomes for rural and rural proofing needing to be a routine policy consideration. But I hadn't found much about how it's been implemented, which I think is because of William's comment that perhaps there's been some challenges there. And then in Scotland, not rural proofing, but island proofing as a result of the Island Scotland Act in 2018, that introduced a commitment to undertake islands community impact assessments, not for every policy, but for policies where the policymaker deems that it's required, but that in itself requires an exercise for the policymaker to make that decision, to review the evidence and decide whether their policy needs to be island proof. And again, there's guidance and case studies and a ministerial report required to the Scottish Parliament. So there might be some interesting learning there from in terms of rural proofing from an island proofing example. So on the basis of that evidence, if you like, I distilled 6 key themes, which I thought might be interesting to look at in terms of similarities and differences. Obviously, the example of Northern Ireland stands out as having that legislative requirement. As far as I know, as I say, that's the only one. But in other countries, rural proofing tends to be mandatory, but with no sanctions, or optional, like in Canada and Finland. And I have to say that there's certainly no evidence that I can find that making rural proofing a legislative requirement has resulted in a significant difference. I think it's fair to say that everywhere rural proofing has been implemented, it's not been done consistently and not been done fully. So there's work to be done, I think, in terms of how to improve it. Clearly, in different countries, in every country, there are different institutional setups and roles. And I think I can't go into too much detail today, but there's been different roles in terms of who does monitoring and reporting, different roles in terms of who leads or who has responsibility for rural proofing, whether that's in government or outside of government. The example of the Rural Policy Council in Finland, for example. And I understand in Sweden, rural proofing is the responsibility of the Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation rather than an agriculture or rural ministry. As I say, in most countries, there's guidance, there's checklists. I think it's fair to say there are differences in terms of the extent to which actual rural communities are engaged in the process of rural proofing. And I think in order to really understand people's lived experiences of digital connectivity or transport, in order to inform that rural proofing, there must be some engagement at least. Obviously, if you have a less local governance or local networking, that's harder to achieve. And some countries have very active leader or other rural networks which can help with that engagement. All countries are different in terms of the proportion of population that's rural, the land area that's rural, the political commitment, if you like, to rural, and the power of rural areas. And again, referring to some of Sally's work, she wrote a really interesting paper with an Australian colleague about the Australian context, where rural isn't really a term that's used. Rural areas don't have a huge amount of political power. And if you were to try and lift the model of rural proofing from England or Northern Ireland or Canada and adopt it in Australia, it simply wouldn't work. So we need to take account of those different rural contexts, I suppose, in different countries. A really interesting question around responsibilities for rural proofing at national, regional and local levels. I think England tried to do this, but the regional infrastructure was ceased to exist several years ago. And there was always a confusion about who was supposed to be doing what. I think the Finnish example is interesting, where there are lots of actors together in that Rural Policy Council. And my final point, I think, is one we can maybe come back to, and that's there's a lot of different terminologies being used: rural proofing, mainstreaming, place-based policy, place proofing. How do these all link together? Which is the right one? In England, certainly the rural proofing is happening. So you rural proof a policy to make sure that rural issues are mainstreamed. But in other countries, the thinking doesn't quite follow that same route. And if we have place-based policies that are flexible enough, do we therefore need to do rural and urban proofing? Is it just about place proofing, so we know that a policy is applicable everywhere? So I think there's some terminology that's interesting to explore. So just very quickly, some of the key lessons learned. I guess certainly still a question about whether rural proofing should be a legislative requirement. And maybe the example in Scotland is interesting, where island proofing is required, but only where a policymaker deems that it should be. But again, that raises questions about how that decision is made and the evidence to inform that decision. I think a really interesting point is one that the rural proofing process tends to be seen quite negatively. It's about rural need, it's about rural disadvantage, and therefore policymakers see it as a burden, and it's almost about special pleading for rural. Can we turn that around? And I think Alexia referred to this, and make the process much more positive, so that it's about unlocking rural potential. It's about ensuring that rural areas contribute as much as they possibly can, rather than changing policies to meet needs. And that's a much more positive argument about maximizing resources when resources are tight. So I think that's something worth exploring. Absolutely, we need clarity over purpose and outcomes. That's not been the case at all. The emphasis has very much been placed in, particularly in England, for example, on the process of rural proofing. But what actually is the outcome? It's about better quality of life, better well-being for rural people. But that's never really been effectively articulated. And I think that links to the point I was just making about whether the aim is to have separate rural policies or general policies that are as applicable to rural as they are to urban. And I think, you know, that's a discussion to be had, and an interesting discussion. And I think, again, Finland is a good example there. We absolutely need clarity about who's doing what at the different governance levels, and that might be different between different countries. And obviously, organisations need to be resourced in order to be able to undertake their responsibilities for rural proofing at different levels. And I think that links to my next point, which is about clarity. There is likely to be a real range of organisations involved in rural proofing, but they need to be sure what their role is, and they need to be held accountable for whatever their role is. And I think there's been some interesting discussion in England and in Canada too about whether actually rural proofing should be the responsibility of a unit or a department in central government. So in the UK, the government, the Cabinet Office, for example, which might have a little bit more power, if you like, when it comes to requiring other departments to undertake rural proofing than perhaps an agriculture or a rural minister or ministry might have. And it absolutely has to be done from the start of the policymaking process and continue right through the policymaking process, right through to implementation. It could be done through piloting programs, for example, in rural areas. And there needs to be buy-in from senior civil servants and politicians right from the start too. Just my final 4 points. If we expect policymakers to undertake rural proofing, they have to have good knowledge and understanding of rural issues. And that's where potentially there's a really strong role for a Department of Agriculture or a rural department to provide training, perhaps secondments to make data available. And it was really interesting that Alexia mentioned the Rural Observatory. There needs to be a key point of contact, and regional and local stakeholders can help too in terms of rural evidence. Engaging with communities, I think, is vitally important. Obviously, it's time consuming, it's resource intensive, but they are the people that have the lived experiences of how things play out in rural areas, and their voice needs to be heard. And a role potentially for other stakeholders, rural committees in parliaments, for example. Academics, researchers, I believe, have a role to play in rural proofing, national audit offices too, and statistics agencies as well. Ideally, we want commitments from all these organisations to inform and to act within the rural proofing process. And finally, appropriate monitoring and reporting is absolutely vital. We need to be able to understand what's going on when policymakers do rural proofing, what's working, what's not, and be able to share that information. And ideally, that should be done independently of government. So a couple of very final concluding comments. I think it's fair to say that rural proofing has been heavily criticised. There isn't a huge amount of academic work out there on rural proofing, but that does exist is critical of the process for all the reasons that I've outlined. But personally, I believe it still has a really important role to play if we can overcome some of these challenges. And I think it does offer great potential to help rural areas and improve to help rural areas to deliver their full potential. There's a question mark about how rural proofing can cover the diversity of rural, especially if there's one checklist in a country. And so maybe there's different approaches that are required in different places for remote rural as opposed to accessible rural, where the challenges are very different. I think this issue of rural proofing or place proofing is a question we can maybe return to. And then just finally, I think there's a real importance of continuous and ongoing and shared learning. As I've hopefully demonstrated, there's lots to learn from these countries that have already implemented rural proofing to a greater or lesser extent. And I think as member states and regions go through the process of introducing and implementing rural proofing, there'll be lots to learn. And I think keeping this shared dialogue open is really, really valuable. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been a useful summary of the paper, but also introduced some new points as well. Those are my contact details if anyone would like to get in contact after today. And thank you very much.